I wonder if you could help me unpack the mindset of an ancient Greek warrior, especially looking at these concepts like time and kleos. What do they mean, and how are they important for better understanding the human beings in the Iliad?
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting point. That Brecht, who is a playwright and scholar for whom I don't have much admiration, does have this really interesting concept, which I'm going to totally slaughter in German, but it's something like the Fremdungseffekt, which is the alienation effect.
Yeah, I would not have wanted to go to one of his plays.
Yeah, I know, right? It's just for that word alone. But it's essentially, in some ways, it has a lot to do with what you're talking about, that one of the things art is good at doing is presenting to us something that we do every day without thinking, but presenting it to us as strange or alien or foreign. And recognizing in the Greeks both our own sort of selves, but also people very, very different from us is a kind of self-knowledge. It's a way of coming to know ourselves by saying, gosh, I too have done something stupid for love, but because it looked so familiar to me, I didn't even really see it. I didn't recognize that experience or wasn't aware of it. Now that I see it in this completely separate and other context, I can really look at it with a kind of distance and appreciate and think about it. Now, when you come down to questions of reading the Iliad in this way, what you said is really apt, right? That each person is going to see something different in this poem, and that's part of its endlessly generative power, is that it does speak to people on where they live. And just like Shakespeare, Homer has a tendency to bring out of us interpretations that say a lot about us as well as about Homer. In many ways, the thing that you read as kind of the core of the Iliad is going to tell you a lot about what you read about in terms of the core of yourself. Let's think then about the question of kleos or time, right? Broadly speaking, this parcel of Greek words, time, kleos, kudos is another one, have to do with the concept of glory or honor. It's a little more complicated than that in the sense that kleos is really the central, survives as a focus of interpretation and importance in the Iliad. Kleos means a lot of things. It can mean rumor or rote. It's contrasted, actually, at one point in the Iliad with true knowledge. We're told in the Catalogue of Ships that we only have kleos, we only have rumor, and we need the muses to tell us, to set the record straight and tell us the truth. But included in that parcel of content is also just sort of what people say, what people are talking about and what's on people's minds. And then from there you get to the idea essentially of, well, what's on people's minds about you? Yeah, what is your kleos? What are people remembering about your life and your experience and the way that you acted in the world? Now, it's further complicated by the fact that for the ancient Greeks, for an Greek mindset of heroism in archaic Greece, kleos is the closest thing you're going to have to like that. It gets, Greek metaphysics, Greek religion gets tricky, but basically we can think about the actual spirit of a person being almost entirely snuffed out upon that person's death. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the Iliad especially, which is a poem full of war and carnage, right? People get cut down and their souls sort of drain out of them and end up in this weird, shadowy limbo underworld where it's not even clear if they really exist in the way that we hope that will exist after death, many of us. Achilles, the central figure of the Iliad, shows up again in the Odyssey, the other great Homeric epic, and he's in this shadowy underworld, having died, and he says to Odysseus, I would rather be a slave on Earth, alive, than be the king of this underworld land. So really, there's a strong sense that being alive is awesome and powerful and vibrant and real and robust, and being dead is empty and meaningless and potentially not even real. Given all of that fact, the thing that you fight for or trade in your death for in many cases is your kleos. That's the closest thing you're going to get to immortality, is that after you die, people will talk about you, they will tell stories about you, and you will live on in collective memory. I mean, this has become a cliche, but in Homer, it's a much more powerful idea. The poem, the Iliad, repeatedly acknowledges this sense of what in Greek is called the es somenoi, those who will be after us, those who are going to be. And hugely centrally important in the poem is, what are the es somenoi going to know? What are those who are about to come after us going to talk about? Because that's going to be the way that we continue to live. And of course, there's another level to that, which is to say that what are they going to know? They're going to know what's in this poem. This poem is a kind of Kleos, right? Homer is aware of himself, I think, or the Homeric poets are aware of themselves as preservers of Kleos. And in many ways, what the characters in the poem are fighting to preserve is themselves in the poem. Given all of that, the central conflict of the poem, I think, takes on a new and much more understandable light. This is a moment really of foreignness for us. It's quite a commonplace at this point to say that the central sort of narrative or complication of the poem is Achilles, the greatest Greek hero, acting like a bit of a brat. People are really hard on Achilles because essentially what happens is he gets snubbed. The king, one of the sort of central kings of the Greek army, loses his own war prize. This
Agamemnon.
Woman.
You're talking about Agamemnon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm talking about Agamemnon. Agamemnon has taken as his own concubine the daughter of a priest of Apollo.
Chryseis.
Exactly. Chryseis. This is a bad move. When you take a priest's daughter as your sex slave, basically, you end up being slaughtered by the god whom that priest serves. And that's exactly what happens. Bad move, Agamemnon. So Chryseis' father calls down holy hell upon the Greeks, which means that Chryseis has to be given back in order for the war effort to continue. Agamemnon can't really take this as like a thing that might happen to him, the great king of, the great leader of the Greek army. And by consequence, he steals Chryseis, who is Achilles' war prize, right? Serving the same function. He's taken this concubine, Chryseis. There's some suggestion that Achilles and Chryseis might actually have a very powerful romantic relationship, but that's actually rather neither here nor there. What matters is that this prize, this concubine, has been stolen from Achilles. Now, there are many things about this that are potentially abhorrent to a modern sensibility, and in the way that you were indicating. We don't advocate at this point that women be treated like property, for one thing. Besides which, Homer says at the outset that Achilles' rage over this episode is the murderer of thousands of Greeks. Achilles is so infuriated about this that he basically pouts in a corner on the shore for a climactic set of days in the war against Troy. And that's the story of the Iliad, is what happens when Achilles is basically absent from the battle. He's the most powerful Greek warrior, and he's having a hissy fit, and everyone is dying because of him. Now, there's no inroad for us to understanding that hissy fit except the concept of Kleos. What Achilles reminds us of several times, and what we sort of are, I think, expected to know already coming to the poem, is that Achilles has been offered a choice by fate. He can either die young in this war and win immortal Kleos, or he can have another sort of central concept in Homer, which is nostos. Nostos means something like homecoming.
Homecoming, yeah.
That's right, and that's what Odysseus is hunting after, right?
In the Odyssey, yeah.
In the Odyssey, yeah. Odysseus wants nostos. Achilles, if he chooses nostos, can have a long, healthy, full life, but no Kleos. If he chooses not nostos, he gets death and Kleos.
And I can't stop thinking about this dilemma that Achilles faces. He receives his fate. He can either go home and live out his days, happy man, loving family, but he'll possess less Kleos, or he can stay at war and die, and then he's going to earn this kind of abstract immortality through Kleos. But it's weird. I don't know if this is just my modern sensibility speaking, but you kind of have to take a leap of faith. Like, how is this Kleos going to benefit me after I'm dead? Like, once Kleos doesn't prevent one's consciousness from being extinguished, does it?
Yeah.
So it does run counter to what most modern people seek in life. Most of us will gladly forego what the Greeks called Kleos in order to live to an old age and in order to be happy with a loved one. And so we aren't as tempted by Kleos today, are we? Or most of us.
You make a really good point. Not only does this prospect not appeal from a modern standpoint, Homer acknowledges, as we've already kind of discussed, right? Homer acknowledges that Achilles' choice is kind of unsatisfactory. And in fact, when he finds himself in the underworld, immortal though his Kleos may be, he's kind of regretting his decision. This, you're right, has to do with a kind of central urge in the human spirit, that's really answered by the Christian idea of a personal resurrection, right? We want to have the sense that what persists after our bodily death will be us as individuals. We're not even really content, I think, if we're honest with ourselves, we're not content with the idea of being kind of dissipated out into a great cosmic all that, somehow we will dissolve and go back to the bosom of divinity whence we came. We kind of want to be us. And this is something, the Greeks are vexed about this question just as much as we are. Lucretius, who is the poet who writes a kind of Latin interpretation of Epicurean philosophy, records a set of Epicurean doctrines which basically tells us, nope, you dissolve. Your spirit is made of atoms, which are physical particles. After you die, you will be just like before you were born. You will not have a consciousness. And so there's an awareness of this urgent and impending doom that meets all people. This is something that, a book that I've recently been really loving is called After Virtue by Alistair MacIntyre. And he's really good about this, about the sense that not only is the Homeric world sort of constructed as a series of trials and conflicts and battles, but there's a very tragic and sort of irreducible acknowledgement in Homer that the outcome of those trials is death, that winning and losing are ultimately the same, and there is no satisfactory recompense for the fact that you will lose your life in battle. Now, that's, I think, at the heart of what has been called the kind of tragic sensibility of Greeks. And for me, in my own sort of personal history of Western culture, that's one of the great needs and yearnings and longings in Greco-Roman society that Judeo-Christian tradition serves when the two meet. But you're right. Kleos is not an appealing reward for us, or even really a satisfactory reward for the Greeks.